This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. We're nearing the end of Streets of New Capenna Limited Season, and that means it's time for me to look back at my set review and talk about what I got wrong and why. My set reviews come out before I've played a single draft of the format, since the goal is to get you ready for your pre-release and the like, so I, of course, always get some stuff wrong, and that was certainly true in this format. Now that I've drafted the format more than 50 times, I'm ready to say where I was wrong. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 22 cards that I got significantly wrong. This is always a useful exercise, since it provides something of a retrospective of the format while also helping me, and you, better understand limited Magic. Alright, let's get started. We're going to start with multicolored, where the first card up is Broker's Ascendancy, which I gave a B+ to. This meant that the card was going to be incredibly good, and you would first pick it almost any time you saw it, but it also means I didn't think it was going to be a bomb, and it certainly was. Even if you just play 1-drop, 2-drop Broker's Ascendancy, it was pretty hard to lose, and there were good 1- and 2-drops in this format, so that wasn't unheard of. And obviously, the wider your board gets, the better it gets. Even if you only have one creature, it can really help you out a lot. It's not completely unbeatable or anything. It doesn't pull you ahead from behind all the time. So I don't quite think it's like an A+ bomb, but it is an A. It's an incredible bomb. There's like 3 or 4 cards in the set that I think are better than it, and that means I was really wrong in giving it a B+. And I don't really know why I was. I mean, I got hung up mostly on the idea that you had to have some board state for it to do its thing. That was kind of silly because you're going to have a board state most of the time. There are times where you have nothing and this is horrible, but those are rare. Next up, it's Civil Servant, which I gave a C+ to. So one recurring thing we're going to see in this video is that this format turned out to be really aggressive, which isn't something I accounted for in my set review, and I don't really think anybody did. I think that surprised most of us who put out set reviews and stuff like that. So 2-drops, especially really good 2-drops, were premium. They were things you took really highly. You took them over a lot of the decent removal even. You took them over a lot of cards. And Civil Servant is one of these really good 2-drops. It's a 2-mana 2/3 to begin with, but then it has a pretty nice effect. It can become a 3/3 with a lifelink if you have another citizen to tap, and you often did in green-white because that's sort of what the archetype was. And you also frequently could put counters or equipment on it. It was just very easy to make Civil Servant into an absolute monster. And, over the first couple of turns, it could make it so your opponent has a very low chance of winning because you've done 6 to them and gained 6 life, and that's just insane. In the end, this was a card that you would pick pretty highly, and a B. So this ended up being one of the best commons in the set, and it's a 2-drop that ended up being way better than I expected it to be. Next up, we've got Hostile Takeover. This is another card where I underrated it. I gave it a B+, just like I did Broker's Ascendancy. I was a little skeptical of how useful it could be. I mean, everything I said in the review about the card is right. You could cast it and it would effectively allow you to, most of the time, kill most of your opponent's board and hold on to at least one thing of yours. But I still had a hard time. It seemed sort of like a finicky card to me where if your opponent had big enough creatures, it'd be a problem. But the fact that you can make, their biggest creature something that has more than 3 toughness into a 1/1, and your best creature into a 4/4 that, already doesn't have 4 toughness, it ends up just being a massive bomb. And I think it's an even bigger one than Broker's Ascendancy. It ends up being like close to a one-sided board wipe most of the time, and it's an A+. So it was definitely a bomb and not just a really, really good card. Next up, we've got Stimulus Package, which I gave a B- to. So, the majority of cards I'm wrong about, I overrate, or underrate rather. This is one I overrated. I looked at this, and in general, I think I overrated a lot of the treasure stuff in the set because I thought it seemed pretty cool. I liked the way they were doing some of the mechanics, and I like this card, which is, one of the signpost uncommons for red-green. 4 mana, you get 2/1/1s, sort of. You get 2 treasures that you can turn into 1/1s. All your other treasures can become 1/1s. If you combine that with Alliance, you can do some wacky things. And all of that turned out to be true, but overall, the red-green deck in the format was the worst. deck in the entire format, and the treasure stuff just really didn't get there. You know, there were some times where you could draft this card and it would really do work for you, but most of the time it just wasn't good enough. The treasure deck in general wasn't. It couldn't keep up with all the tempo that Brokers was throwing at you and stuff like that. And yeah, so in the end, it was more like a C-. I mean, I could maybe see making a case for it to be like a build around B-, but it took a very, very specific deck that had a lot of other treasure and a lot of other alliance, and you didn't end up in that deck that often. Moving into white now, we have another card I overrated, Angelic Observer, which I gave a B- to. You know, it's funny because the Citizen deck did end up being really good, but this card wasn't really part of why. It's not a bad card in that deck, certainly, but I thought it would be one of the premier payoffs, but it just turns out it's not that easy to make this cost 4 or less. You know, 5 is very doable, and sometimes you do 4, and sometimes you do a lot less than that, but it ended up just not feeling that efficient or too inefficient in general to be something that you really wanted, and you could really only play it in a green-white deck that had a bunch of citizens, and in the end, it was really just like a solid payoff for that deck. You would much rather have, you know, the 2-mana 2/3 we just looked at than the Angelic Observer, partly because this format's really fast, you want to get 2 drops down quickly, and the Observer doesn't exactly fit into that game plan, so in the end, it was more like a C. Next up, we've got Backup Agent. You know, it's funny. I always like these 2-mana 1/1s that put a +1/+1 counter somewhere, like a reasonable amount, usually more than most people. But I only gave this one a C, you know, which means it's a solid playable. You'll cut it sometimes. But that turned out not to be true. This ended up being one of White's best commons, not its best common. That was Inspiring Overseer, of course, which I did get that right. That one was pretty obvious, though, so shouldn't pat myself on the back too much. But anyway, Backup Agent ended up just having a lot going on that slotted well into the entire format, especially because Brokers ended up being the best deck, and it really synergized with both of them. It's a citizen, so you could play this, put a counter on your 2/3 cat, attack with it, and then give it lifelink by tapping the Backup Agent. Very common line of play with a couple of commons. Or you could play the Backup Agent on turn 2 and then play a Celestial Regulator on turn 3 and lock down one of your opponent's creatures and attack. And, you know, that's all commons. I've mentioned all commons, and those are the kinds of things that this card could really enable. It had the +1/+1 counter synergies covered, and it's a citizen, and it just turns out 2 drops were good in this format. And in the end, this is something you first pick sometimes. You know, in most formats, that's just not true about this. Even to me, somebody who usually likes this kind of card because it can give you real value all game long, because the counter going anywhere can have a big impact all game long. Put it on something evasive, right? But it ended up having so much extra synergy, and the format was really fast that it ends up at a B-. It's that good of a common. White had a lot of good commons, and this is only White's 3rd best common, so that tells you there's 2 more that have even higher grades, one of them being the Inspiring Overseer, and I think the other one we'll see later on in this list. Next up, it's Illuminator Virtuoso. So, again, 2 drops, better than I expected them to be in the format, but I still think I probably overrated this, you know, underrated it rather, because I gave it a C. A 2-mana 1/1 with Double Strike, that's fine. But I, you know, in my set review, I basically said, I don't see myself casting things on this that often, and that just turned out not to be true. Combat tricks are good in a format that is this fast, and so in a format where combat tricks are good, obviously Illuminator Virtuoso is going to be amazing. And that's exactly the kind of format this was. You were playing the 2-mana +2/+2 trick, or the 1 green mana +2/+2, or the 2 generic and a blue mana that makes the creature into a 4/4 flyer. You were playing these all the time in Brokers decks. And so that made the Virtuoso even better. It also had a mini combo with Security Bypass that made it really powerful. So in the end, it ended up being an excellent uncommon, and a card you never cut, and a card you take with the first pick pretty happily, and so it was more like a B in the end. Next up, I've got Rabble Rousing. So this one is another one that I underrated. I gave it a B, and this is partly because I misread the card. You know, when I saw this card, in my mind, the tokens you got came into play tapped. And I don't know why I thought that, but that's kind of what I was looking at with the card. And in my set review, I said something along the lines of, you know, it's not going to help you that much if you're behind, because you can't just attack with your stuff and hope it's okay. But turns out they come into play untapped, and that means You can protect yourself with the 1/1s these generate just by attacking with a couple of your evasive creatures. And, getting the hideaway to trigger was also fairly easy. You only needed 5 creatures to attack and you would get it, whatever free spell it is, right there on the spot. And so in the end, this was definitely a bomb, not just a B, which means a really good card that you never cut, that you would splash, that will pull you into its color. In the end, it was just a straight up bomb. It was an A. Even if you were behind on board, it could really help you out, and that is a big deal. So in the end, rabble-rousing, a bomb for sure. All right, here is Rafine's Informant. So I mentioned earlier when talking about Backup Agent that it was the 3rd best white common, and I said Inspiring Overseer was number 1. Well, Rafine's Informant was number 2 in the end, the 2nd best white common, and I did like it a reasonable amount. I gave it a C+. I was fairly high on Connive, I thought, in the set review, and it ended up being even better than I expected, partly because the +1/+1 counter synergies at common are really strong, and also this is a 2-drop. Again, 2-drops are better in this format than they are in a lot of formats. The Rafine's Informant connives for you, which can set up your graveyard. It can give you a +1/+1 counter. You can keep a lot of 2-land hands that have like 1 informant in it because it can help you find your 3rd land. It really gives you a good chance of doing it. And then there were a few graveyard synergies in the set, like discarding the expendable 1-mana 1/1 who makes a fish token from the graveyard was a pretty powerful thing to do with this for some serious value. And in the end, this was another 2-drop that I think in a lot of formats, C+ probably would have been right. But in this format where you like to connive, you like the +1/+1 counter upside, this ended up being a B, and White's 2nd best common. And part of the reason White was so good in this format is Overseer, Informant, and Backup Agent are all really incredible commons. 2 of them are 2-drops. Yeah. All right, next up we've got Rumor Gatherer. So here's one I overrated. I gave this a B, and I really loved the design here. I thought, if you could play a card that makes 2 bodies, you were going to be really happy, drawing a card off of it. And that was true, but there are a couple of shortcomings this card has in this format. One of them is costing double colored mana is kind of a problem for the more aggressive decks. A lot of them like to play these 2-drops and 3-drops that are 2 colors, and so you really need to have a good mana base to consistently play, one of these things on turn 2 or turn 3. And if you're throwing a double white card into the mix, it does get harder to cast. Another problem is 1 toughness was very vulnerable in this format. You had an uncommon that makes devil tokens that deals with it really easily. You had Night Clubber, which just decimates a card like Rumor Gatherer, usually blows up the rest of your board. You had the 1 black mana casualty 1 spell that could do 1 damage to something. Like, there were a lot of problems with only having 1 toughness in this format. And so Rumor Gatherer in the end ended up being harder to make work than I expected. It was still a pretty good card. But the mana value, the trickiness of the mana, coupled with the fact that it has 1 toughness, did make it weaker than I expected. The very first deck I drafted in this format, funnily enough, I had 3 Rumor Gatherers in it. It seemed pretty sweet, but I just kept getting, I was drawing extra cards and stuff, but I was just getting run over by all this tempo that was just tapping my stuff down, attacking me, bouncing things. And that, at the time I was like, well, that's variance, right? Not so much. It's just not that powerful to have an effect like this in this format in the end. Like I said, it's still pretty good. It's a C+. If your mana can handle it, you never cut it from a white deck. It's just not this really high quality uncommon I expected. Next up, I've got Skycrier, yet another 2-drop that I underrated. I gave this one a C-. So Skycrier, 2 mana for a 1/1 flying lifelink and a citizen. Those are all things I noted in the set review, and I was like, you can put counters or equipment on it, and that's nice. But I undervalued all of those things. All of those things ended up being even better in this format, again, partly because 2-drops are really good in the format. Flyers are nice. Putting counters on a lifelinker is really good. Putting the +2/+1 trample equipment on Skycrier, equipping it for 1 mana is a really common occurrence. It's good with tricks. It's good with all kinds of things. And so it ended up being a pretty good common. It's not as good as the other white commons we mentioned in the top 3, but it's a 2-drop that you are pretty happy to take and that you don't generally cut. Even the draw effect actually mattered sometimes. There are a decent number of games in this format that are determined by drawing your card that makes it so your opponent's thing can't block. And if you're giving yourself 2 shots at that, you have a better chance of doing it. Obviously, it's not great to use unless your opponent unless you have no other choice, basically. But that happened often enough that it worked out okay. And in the end, this was a C+, not a C-. Let's move now to blue. White is the one that I got the most stuff wrong in, interestingly. Let's move to blue now. First up, I've got Make Disappear, which I gave a D+ to. So Make Disappear, it's in a long line of counter spells that aren't hard counters. I just wasn't that impressed with it in limited. As a D+ would indicate, that means it's a card you play if you have to, and it's not a complete disaster, but you probably cut it if you can. But that ended up not being the case. This ended up being a solid playable and a C. And there's one big reason for this is Blitz. Being able to actually counter a Blitz creature is a big deal, because if you can't do something about a Blitz creature, your opponent's going to generate some serious value out of it once it hits the table. Removal's not good against them. Same is sort of true of shield counter creatures. This lets you 1-for-1 them, which is sometimes really hard to do. So the format had some stuff going on that made this counterspell better. Also, it wasn't ideal as a 2-drop, right? Because it's situational, but you would play this in decks where you're a little short on 2-drops, and this can sort of fill in because it can let you counter your opponent's 2 or 3-drop. And, Casualty 1 was also pretty easy to trigger on it. And another thing that made it good, too, actually, is Connive, because there would be points of the game where it's like, okay, I'm never doing anything with this Make Disappear, and you could just throw it away for value then. And all of that just really combined to make this a perfectly solid playable. Not something I think it would be in a lot of formats for the reasons I mentioned, but in this one, it was solid. Next up, we've got Security Bypass. I mentioned this when we were talking about Illuminator Virtuoso. I gave this a D+ as well. I just didn't like how restrictive it was and how risky it was. Your creature's only unblockable if it's attacking alone. That didn't seem amazing to me. And while I liked Conniving, what I really had to think about was, does hitting my opponent with the thing I put this on once give me enough value to overcome the downside, which is that you can get easily 2-for-1. And I do think the answer is sort of no. Like, just hitting your opponent once with this thing usually doesn't give you a full card of value, but it ended up being easier to hit your opponent like twice with it. Now, you needed to have a number of things going on in your deck for it to be playable. I do think it was still like a D+ in your typical deck in the format, but if you had a few things going on, it was a B-. One of these was having an Illuminator Virtuoso or 2. The same is true if you just had creatures who are already evasive, so they can still attack with the rest of your board while still allowing you to connive. So this means fish tokens or flyers. It goes well on something with lifelink like Skycrier. Like, there were enough keywords and unblockable around that you could really find ways to use Security Bypass even when your creature wasn't attacking alone. And then, the counter upside and all of that mattered too. So it was like a B- build around. Like, that was where it could sort of peak in a deck that had like 2 Virtuosos and a few other good targets for it. I do think people overplay this a little bit in the format because it is still so risky. You can get 2-for-1 really horribly if you're not careful, but it gets less risky in the kind of deck I just described. Next up, I've got Sleep with the Fishes. I gave this a C+, which means, you always play it, but I don't love it. It's not something I want to first pick, but that ended up being wrong. It was a B. And so why was I wrong about this one? Well, one of the reasons I was a little conservative with my grade, and I said this outright in the video, is because of the presence of Casualty. I didn't like the idea that you could put this on something and then your opponent could sacrifice it for value. And that is a concern, but there are a few things going on in the set that even this out. One of them is shield counters. This is a great way to deal with a shield counter creature. So while one mechanic in the set makes it a little worse, another one makes it a lot better. And it turned out that the deck that had a lot of shield counters in it came together a lot more often than the deck that had a lot of Casualty in it. So the metagame and the way it shook out made Sleep with the Fishes better than it would have been otherwise. In the set review, I said, in a set that didn't have a sacrifice theme, it would probably be like a B-, because you get a 1/1 unblockable and you lock something down. And in the end, I think this ended up being even better than that. It's relatively cheap removal, which is important, and it deals with all kinds of creatures. And even if your opponent does sacrifice the thing that, let's say they sack it to something with Casualty, you're usually making them do that as sort of a consolation prize. Like you put this on an intimidating creature that they don't ever want to sacrifice anyway, and then you put it on that creature, it doesn't feel nearly as bad. So this ended up being premium removal and a great card in the end. Next up, I've got Witness Protection. Gave this a D+, and I think in a lot of formats, that's about right. You know, paying 1 blue for an effect like this, it's, you know, you can think of it as removal, and in this format, it was removal more often than it might have been otherwise. Good removal, or solid removal anyway, more often than it would have been in most. But the thing I don't like about this kind of card usually is that your opponent still has a creature that can attack or block, right? So it doesn't get a blocker out of the way good removal does if you're an aggressive deck, and it doesn't stop attacking altogether the way good removal does if you're a more defensive deck. But there is a shortage of really cheap removal in this format, and you need to answer some of the powerful 2-drops in this format right away, like the 2-mana 2/3 cat we saw at the beginning of the video. If you can't block that, and you usually can't until like turn 3 or 4, you need to play something like Witness Protection to shut it down. And there are a bunch of other really nice 2 and 3 drops around that Witness Protection is necessary to shut down because your other removal just isn't going to do it in time. So overall, it ended up actually being a solid card. You know, it ended up being a straight up C, a card that, yeah, I mean, you hope for better removal, but playing 1 copy of this in your blue decks was pretty commonplace. And, you know, there were some feel bad moments, like if your opponent's creature has counters on them, they just stay there. And that was another thing that made me conservative about the card. But you get to choose what you put this on, and usually you do it early enough in the game that, you know, it's not a big problem in terms of counters and stuff like that. Let's move to black now. First up, we've got Cemetery Tampering. So I said this was going to be an F in most of the decks in the format, but I saw an upside here that ended up not existing. And that upside was, you know, I was thinking about loading up your graveyard and getting a ton of value out of it. But graveyard decks in this format weren't as prominent as I expected. You know, blue-black definitely cares about the graveyard, but having a card that just loads your graveyard for you and then eventually will give you a free card just wasn't worth it in the format. And to be honest, you know, I think I would have overrated this card in any format, except, you know, I guess maybe the most graveyardy formats around, like original Innistrad. Maybe it works out there. But I think the fact that it doesn't do anything but mill you, and it actually can quickly kill you if you're playing in limited, I think that means it's probably just an F in most formats, and the build around B, you know, which I didn't think was going to be a common occurrence, but it's like, you know, it has some upside. But it doesn't. This was just an F. You never played it, and sorry if you played it based on my advice. All right, next up I have Cutthroat Contender. I gave this a D. You know, I saw it as kind of a 1-mana 2/1 with a downside, and that downside is that you have to pay 1 life to make it a 2/1. And it certainly wasn't like a great card, but because this format ended up being faster than I expected, it ended up being better, of course. Like having a 1-drop that can hit for 2 gets a lot better. On top of that, it was also one of the only ways where you felt kind of good about playing a Casualty 2 card. Like if you have Light 'em Ups or Join the Maestros, Cutthroat Contender gets to be a lot better. You know, neither of those cards ended up being incredible in the format, of course, but, you know, you played them in the deck, and if you had Cutthroat Contenders, they were a really nice way to cast those Casualty 2 spells, because you only lose a 1-mana creature, and you definitely get that card worth of value back by casualtying it anyway. So, you know, it wasn't great in the end. You ended up cutting it a lot still, but it was more like a C- than a D. Next up, I've got Illicit Shipment. This is one I actually overrated, and it wasn't like I thought it was good. I gave it a D. You know, most of the time a tutor is an F in limited, an expensive tutor like this one. But I thought maybe the fact that you got to search up 2 cards with it, which means, you know, you're getting 2 cards instead of just 1, I thought that would be pretty good. But the problem is you're still giving up 2 cards usually, because Casualty 3 is big. And also, you know, part of what made Casualty, especially Casualty 2 and 3, a little worse in this format than it looked like it might on paper is you just couldn't go behind on the board for an effect, especially one like this that doesn't actually impact the board. You just couldn't do it in this format. You know, giving up board presence for the future, you know, 2 cards, again, but you're just really breaking even between the creature you sacrifice and the shipment. Like, that just wasn't good enough. And it was a really bad thing to do in the format. If you cast this, you're probably going to lose the game, and that means it's an F. Next up, we've got Incriminate, another black card I overrated. I gave it a C. I thought there would be enough situations where you could pick 2 creatures and, get to your opponent. But, the reserves I had about this card, the reservations I had about this card, that is, were, there would be times where you couldn't do that. And in the end, that ended up being true more often than not. And it wasn't completely unplayable. Like, if you really needed removal, okay, but it was like a D-, which is pretty close to unplayable. Next, we're going to Red, where I only think I got 1 card wrong, but it's another one that I overrated. I gave Rob the Archives a B-. I saw this card, and I really thought about casting it in the later part of the game and basically drawing 3 cards. And that can happen, of course, but it's so bad in the early game. In a format where you have to add to the board early, and you have one of these in your hand instead of like a 2-drop, any random 2-drop creature, it feels pretty bad. And, looking at the top 4 cards of your library, even successfully casting all of those in the same turn, even in the late game, wasn't that easy. And that's partly because there wasn't always a late game in this format. If you weren't adding to the board like you should be because you're playing Rob the Archives, you're not going to get to the point of the game where you can cast Rob the Archives. So it was like a D in the end. It had sort of a niche use in the more controlling Maestros decks where like having one of these was fine. But it wasn't, definitely wasn't very good in the end. So I actually don't think I got any green cards wrong, weirdly enough, since we got like a million wrong in white and blue, but I think I did okay on green. So we're going to move to Artifacts now, which is where, we'll close things out. So Arc Spitter, another card I overrated. I gave it a C. This card had an interesting design to me. I liked that it was cheap to cost and cheap to equip. And then the ability, it seemed like the threat of activation of that ability was a big deal to me. Like you'd be able to attack your opponent, and if you had mana up, your opponent just couldn't do things. They couldn't block your creature. And that's sort of true. And it also gets rid of shield counters, which is kind of cool. But again, playing a card that doesn't actually do a whole lot other than keep your creature from getting blocked as effectively often wasn't worth it in the format, especially in a format that had lots of better ways to prevent blocks from happening. It also didn't help that there were a lot of tricks and things in this format. If you sink mana into this and then your opponent, does something to make it so their creature's just fine, it feels pretty terrible. So in the end, you just never played this. It was an F. And then our last card to look at is Cement Shoes. This is another equipment I overrated. I gave it a C. I looked at this card and I looked at all the tokens, especially like the fish tokens in the format, and I was like, this might actually do a thing. You might be able to actually play this, equip it to a token, smash with that token, and then maybe move it to something else. But you just don't have the time or the luxury of doing things like that in this format, just moving this sort of thing around, to make sure your fish untaps. Like, all of that is way too clunky. If this was equip 1 in the end, I think it probably would have been a C. That shows you just how much an equip cost can limit a card, though, because in the end, I think it was an F. So those are the 22 cards that I was wrong about in Streets of New Capenna. For a reminder, we're not too far away from the next set review, which will be for Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. It's going to be the first Alchemy limited format we've ever had. That means it's arena only, basically, and has some digital only mechanics. I'm a bit skeptical of the whole thing, frankly, but it will certainly be interesting to see what this limited format looks like. And, it could definitely turn out to be a lot of fun. We've seen very little of the set at this point, even though it comes out pretty soon and the set review is like, I don't know, a week and a half away. So it's hard to say at this point, but I'm willing to give it a chance, even if I am a little bit skeptical. Could end up being a good limited format. It could also end up being kind of bad, but that's true of any format, I guess. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, including the Baldur's Gate set review, which is coming in the relatively near future, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on old videos, including more where I talk about cards that I was wrong about in the various set reviews I've done, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile to support the channel, you can by buying merch, by becoming a patron, by becoming a YouTube member. You can find all those things in the description. Thanks for watching.